Hello everyone, it's Robin the Delta Crafter and I want to thank you for joining me for another video on my YouTube channel. Today we're going to be using the technique of ink blending to highlight some details on some images that we've die cut to make those details stand out more. Let's go ahead and get started with this card. We're going to be using the Lovely Layer Poinsettia die set from Honeybee Stamps. I have to be honest with you, I recorded this video some time ago, so while the dies that we'll be using do lean towards holiday, the techniques that we'll be using could be used at any time of the year. So I've brought in a piece of Nina Classic Crest Solar White in 80-pound weight, and that's the cardstock that I'm going to be cutting my main poinsettia images from. This die set has several pieces that will create a beautifully layered poinsettia. Notice that some of the petals in the poinsettia have a lot of detail in them and some of them don't. The pieces that have the detail are what we're going to be highlighting today. So I'm going to tape all of my dies down using some Easy C tape, and then I'm going to run these dies through my die cutting machine. I have a Spellbinder's Platinum machine, which is the larger machine, but you use whatever die cutting machine you may have. I decided that I wanted to add a little bit of oomph to this card by adding some metallic gold cardstock for my leaves and as well as the little center of the flower. As I was pulling those pieces off the leaves in the center of the flower, I realized I left one of the layers of the poinsettia off. So I'm just going to use a scrap piece to make sure that I run all of these through the die cutting machine all together. So I'm going to poke out my little top layer of my poinsettia, and then I'm going to poke out my gold leaves and my gold center, and then we're going to be ready to move on to the next part of making this card. I love the details that these gold leaves are going to add to the card. For my background, I decided that I wanted to start with a piece of colored cardstock, so I'm using a piece of light blue cardstock here. And I'm going to ink up the edges using some Tumbled Glass Distress ink. My Tumbled Glass Distress ink gets a lot of use. So I always keep a re-inker on hand that I often have to pull out because, like I said, this particular color gets a lot of use. I use it for skies, I use it for water, I use it for just about anything, anytime I want to have a beautiful blue addition to my card or my ink blending. So what I've done is I've just gone around the edge of this card panel, which I've cut down to 4 by 5 1/4. And I've gone and inked up the edges so that we kind of get a highlight in the middle and it draws our eye to the middle of the card. I'm going to add some white splatter to this card. And for this card, I used some white acrylic paint. I've added some water with my distress sprayer to that acrylic paint, and I'm just going to mix those two together with a paintbrush until I feel like they have blended very well. So it took me just a few seconds or so, about half a minute or so, to get that blended up to a consistency that I was happy with. So I'm bringing in my splatter box, which this is just a box that I've saved from some supplies that were shipped to me. And now I'm going to splatter this white acrylic paint across my my panel that I inked up earlier. So I'm just going to use my finger and tap it on my paintbrush to get that splatter effect all over my panel. And now I'm going to pull that panel out. I'm going to take a look at it, and you can see that because I used the acrylic paint, the splatters have a little bit of dimension to them. You may like that, you may not like that. It's up to you how you want to add your splatter. Now I'm going to bring in the Bitty Buzzwords holiday set and use those to create my sentiment for the card. This stamp and die set has quite a few holiday words in it, like Christmas holiday words, but there are a few words in there that could be used for other times of the holiday, like for instance for this winter card. So because I'm going to be heat embossing my sentiment, I did go ahead and apply some powder to my paper using my Rabbit Hole Designs powder tool. I grabbed the Joy Sentiment from the Stamp and Die set, and I'm just sticking that in my MISTI so that if I need to restamp this image, I can easily do that and stamp in the same place because I'm using a MISTI stamping tool. So I'm bringing in some VersaMark ink, which is a watermark ink, and that's what I'm going to use to stamp my image with. This is a clear sticky ink that once I apply my embossing powder to my paper, the ink will grab onto the embossing powder and the embossing powder will stick in the shape of my image. So I'm going to bring in that gold embossing powder. This is just a gold embossing powder that I've had in my stash for quite some time. And I'm going to sprinkle that embossing powder over my image and using a coffee filter to catch the excess so that I can put it back into my jar. So I've sprinkled that powder over. I'm going to tilt it and tap a little bit on my paper, which it should remove any of the excess powder that may be hanging around. Then I'm going to take my coffee filter and pour that excess embossing powder back into my jar for future use. Over to the side, my heat tool has been heating up so that when I'm ready to melt my embossing powder, it's nice and hot. I always like to hit my embossing powder from the back first. That kind of melts some of the powder at the bottom, and then it will kind of grab onto the powder at the top. So when I bring my heat tool around, none of that powder on the top blows away. So I'm just going to heat this up until everything is nice and melted. I'm going to get a beautiful look from this beautiful bright gold embossing powder. So now that the embossing is done, now let's move on to the assembly and inking of our poinsettia. On the back of the Lovely Layers dies, which there are many dies in this collection from Honeybee, the back panels always give you a layout of how to assemble the pieces. And these are really, really handy. They also have a QR code that you can scan and get more directions on their website. So now that I've got all my pieces laid out, I'm going to bring in that Tumbled Glass Distress ink again. And this is the ink that I'm going to be using to highlight the details of the poinsettia. I'm also going to be bringing in a small ink blending brush. This ink blending brush is from Simon Says Stamp, and it's a small detail brush with a round head. This is a great size tool to have when you want to get into smaller detailed areas. So here I'm showing you a close-up of the detailed areas that we're going to be inking up. So notice that some of the petals have the detail and some of them don't. Those petals that do not have the detail will have other petals layered on top of them as you assemble the layers of the poinsettia, and that's where some of that depth and dimension is going to be created. These Lovely Layer sets are some of my favorites that are out there on the market. So I'm just bringing in my small detail ink blending brush, and I'm adding that blue highlight starting in the middle of my poinsettia and kind of moving out towards the edge on the detailed petals on the flower, or on each piece of the flower. Kind of moving in a circular motion, and I'm just going to add a little bit of color to that layer and move on to the next. So now that all of our detailed petals have ink on them, we can go ahead and start assembling our layers together. So I have the layering guide over to the right, and I'm using that to help me to figure out how I need to layer these panels up. Because sometimes when you get to like this layer, it can be hard to figure out where exactly it needs to lay on top of the next card. So I like that they've used just a little bit lighter shade of ink, and so you can see which one goes where. A little bit lighter shade of ink on the guide, so you can see the distinct different petals. So I'm putting down the fourth and final layer of the petals, and I'm going to place an acrylic block on top of them to make sure that there's a little bit of weight to help make sure everything is secure to each other. And to secure all of my layers together, I'm using a Barely Arts glue, and I'm using the fine tip nozzle that's included with the glue. So I've just added the gold center to the middle of my flower. I'm going to place my acrylic block back on top of my flower to make sure that again, apply some weight and make sure everything is nice and secure. So I'm going to take my pieces and kind of lay them out on my panel to figure out just how I want everything to be laid out. So on the bottom, I'm going to have my gold leaves. And then I'm going to lay my white inked up detailed poinsettia on top of those leaves. I love how the highlighted area of the poinsettia connects and works with the inked up panel that we've created for the background. So I'm happy with my layout, so I'm going to bring in a piece of press and seal and press on top of my flowers and my leaves, because I want to make sure everything stays exactly where it is. Then I'm going to come in with that Barely Arts glue again and apply a good amount to the back of my flower and leaves. And I'm going to use that press and seal to be kind of like some handles or a guide to apply and press down my flower and leaves to my inked up and splattered background panel. And once everything is in place, I'm going to slowly pull that press and seal back, and everything will be nice and secured to the panel, and it'll be exactly where I want it to be. I love that press and seal trick. It's a great one to use when you have certain things that you want to be in certain places. So off camera, I did go ahead and stamp and die cut the sub sentiment. It came from that Bitty Buzzwords sentiment set as well. So I've gone ahead and layered up a couple of pieces of scrap cardstock on the back of that sentiment to kind of give it a little lift. And then I die cut out the joy sentiment as well as a couple of blank joys to layer up and give the joy sentiment a little bit of depth and dimension as well. So I'm adding that to the card and pressing that in place and making sure everything is nice and secure. And I love the way the splatter just peeks out from everything from behind. I wanted my panel to be popped up on the back of my card base, so I did go ahead and apply some foam adhesive tape to the back of my card panel. I've created a top folding card base from some Accent Opaque 120-pound weight cardstock, and that's what I've applied my inked up and decorated panel to. And now that is attached to the card base, this card is complete. I hope you have enjoyed watching this video today. If you have, please consider giving it a thumbs up. I'd love for you to join me on Instagram and Facebook, where you can find me under the Delta Crafter, as well as on my website, thedeltacrafter.com. All of the products I've used today will be listed and linked below, as well as on my coordinating blog post. I hope you guys have enjoyed yourselves, and until next time, enjoy!